I received a rusty old key. My brother got the mansion, the corporate shares, and the cash. He looked me dead in the eye and said our parents had erased me before forcing me out of the house that very night. But I decided to take that rusty key and put it into the exact door it belonged to, and when that heavy steel finally clicked open, I was completely paralyzed by what was actually hiding inside. My name is Katrina. I am 29 years old, and for the past 7 years I was the invisible backbone of our family's engineering empire. I fixed the crises, I balanced the books, and I kept the legacy alive. But tonight, sitting in the grand study of our family estate, the lawyer's words sounded like a death sentence. The will had just been executed. My brother wasn't screaming or throwing a fit. He was perfectly calm, which made it so much worse. The lawyer announced that he now held 80% of the voting shares and all the core commercial real estate. My heart dropped as the sickening realization hit me. Over the last few years, under the guise of streamlining operations, he had manipulated me into signing a mountain of proxy documents and power of attorney forms. He hadn't just beaten me in the will, he had legally diluted my ownership long before our father even passed away. He stood up, adjusting his custom-tailored suit. He didn't throw the key at me. Instead, he patronizingly slid a single heavily oxidized key across the glass conference table. "You always had a soft spot for fixing broken, nostalgic things," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I think the abandoned mechanics workshop down in Pittsburgh is the perfect legacy for you." It was a calculated intellectual insult. He was stripping away a decade of my blood and sweat, exiling me to a dead non-profit generating property. Next to him, his wife simply took a delicate sip of her chamomile tea, giving me a pathetic, pitying smile. They weren't just taking my money, they were erasing my identity. Have you ever had your life's work legally stolen by your own flesh and blood? Have you ever been pushed out into the cold by the people you trusted most? Drop a comment below with your city and share your experience. And make sure to subscribe to the channel, because what I found in that worthless workshop changed absolutely everything. I didn't argue. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a single tear. I picked up the cold, rusty key, grabbed my lone suitcase, and walked out of the massive oak doors forever. Standing on the curb in the freezing Pennsylvania snow, I pulled out my phone and ordered a ride to the interstate bus terminal. The empire was his, but the night was mine. The rhythmic thud of the Greyhound bus tires against the cracked asphalt faded into the distance, leaving behind a profound silence along the desolate industrial corridor of Pittsburgh. The air here carried the sharp metallic bite of the nearby Ohio River. Before me stood a towering brick facade, its windows obscured by years of grime. This was the crown jewel of my inheritance, a dilapidated clockwork and precision mechanics workshop that the family ledger had officially classified as a dead asset. Gripping the cold, oxidized key, I guided it into the ancient iron padlock securing the heavy oak entry door. The metal resisted at first, the tumblers stiff with disuse, but with a firm twist, the internal mechanism yielded with a satisfying clunk. I pushed the door open, fully bracing myself for the stench of rotting wood and abandonment. Instead, the draft that greeted me was surprisingly dry. It smelled of aged cedar, dormant lubricating oil, and the distinct tang of brass. I stepped inside, sealing out the biting wind. Moonlight filtering through the skylights revealed a space that was not a chaotic dumping ground, but rather a sanctuary frozen in time. Massive industrial lathes and precision milling machines sat in orderly rows, each meticulously draped in heavy canvas tarps to protect them from moisture. I dropped my suitcase near a worn leather workbench, noting the heavy-duty American Standard 240-volt outlets lining the perimeter. The cavernous room was not completely silent. Beneath the stillness, my ears caught a sound, a low, rhythmic hum vibrating through the floorboards. It was the undeniable frequency of an independent off-grid backup generator running on a continuous loop. Keeping a localized power grid actively maintained in a commercial zoning district required specialized municipal permits and heavy fees. Walking deeper into the shadows, I noticed the walls were retrofitted with commercial-grade polyurethane acoustic panels and advanced thermal insulation. The ambient temperature was rigidly stabilized at a cool 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Moisture and humidity are the absolute worst enemies of high-carbon steel and delicate brass gears. Someone was spending a small fortune on utility overhead just to keep the atmospheric conditions inside this massive shell perfectly static. My mind raced. Our father had been a ruthless corporate strategist who would mercilessly amputate any branch of the company that failed to yield a profit. Yet for over a decade he had quietly bled capital into maintaining this specific non-operational facility. I remembered the fierce boardroom arguments, Pierce shouting demanding the property be liquidated. Our father had always shut him down, treating this parcel of real estate as untouchable, paying the property taxes out of a private trust. Pierce assumed it was just an old man's foolish sentimentality, a pathetic cling to the company's humble origins. That was why he had so happily dumped the deed into my lap, assuming he was burying me under useless bricks and insurmountable liabilities. But standing here, feeling that mechanical vibration humming through the soles of my shoes, the agonizing sting of betrayal began to evaporate. The suffocating weight of having my life's work legally hijacked by a proxy loophole suddenly felt distant. I was no longer the grieving, discarded sister. My pulse steadied as the analytical machinery of my own mind clicked into gear. I was a mechanical engineer raised to dissect complex systems. I looked out over the canvas-covered machines. The maintained dry air, the hidden power draw, the structural reinforcements, none of it aligned with a derelict write-off. This wasn't a punishment. It was a deliberately constructed equation, an architectural puzzle hiding in plain sight, and I held the only variable needed to solve it. The sharp, methodical click of expensive leather wingtips against the aged hardwood floor abruptly shattered the heavy isolation of the building. I looked up from the drafting table to see a man in a pristine charcoal gray Brioni suit, stepping carefully over a stray brass fitting. It was Sterling, the ruthless senior corporate counsel who handled all of Pierce's high-stakes acquisitions. He did not come alone. He carried a thick, leather-bound legal folio, and his expression held the practiced, emotionless mask of a man delivering an execution order. Sterling did not bother with pleasantries. He walked directly to the steel workbench, flicked a speck of dust from its surface, and laid out a stack of dense, heavily notarized contracts. Pierce was not a fool. He had never been driven by blind malice alone. His cruelty was always a byproduct of his financial ambition. Sterling coldly explained the reality of the situation. My brother was in the final stages of closing a massive 8-figure real estate deal, selling the sprawling industrial acreage surrounding this very property to a commercial developer. However, under strict federal and state regulations, transferring commercial manufacturing zones required a flawless Phase 1 environmental site assessment. The developer's underwriters were demanding absolute legal clearance. They needed guaranteed proof that the site harbored no hazardous waste, no leaking subterranean oil tanks, and no lingering industrial contaminants. This dilapidated structure, packed with heavy machinery and decades-old chemical lubricants, represented a catastrophic liability. Pierce needed it completely gutted and certified clean before escrow could close. Sterling tapped his gold fountain pen against the bold heading of the top document, binding covenant for site remediation and asset liquidation. The strategy was breathtakingly vicious. Pierce was using the law to legally quarantine the financial toxicity. The contract dictated that by accepting the deed to this property, I was explicitly assuming total financial and legal responsibility for the mandatory Environmental Protection Agency cleanup protocols. Under federal compliance laws, the costs of industrial remediation are mercilessly enforced. I would have to hire the specialized hazmat teams, pay for the disposal of the archaic heavy metals, and shoulder a debt that could easily bankrupt a small corporation. "Your brother is offering a gesture of goodwill," Sterling stated, his voice flat and transactional. "If you sign this assumption of liability today, he will authorize a one-time disbursement of $15,000 from a private family trust. It is enough for you to secure a modest apartment and begin a new life." Sterling paused, letting the silence stretch before delivering the final blow. "If you refuse, we will file an immediate injunction with the Municipal Zoning Board tomorrow morning. We will have the city inspector condemn this structure as an imminent environmental hazard. The doors will be padlocked by law enforcement, and you will be escorted off the premises with absolutely nothing." I looked down at the dense paragraphs of legal jargon. Pierce had orchestrated a flawless corporate bottleneck. He was offering me a microscopic bribe to legally absorb his multi-million-dollar cleanup problem, ensuring his lucrative real estate deal moved forward without a hitch. He expected the overwhelming threat of municipal eviction and insurmountable debt to break my spirit. He perfectly calculated my desperation, assuming that a freezing, newly evicted woman would blindly grab the cash lifeline and sign her own financial death warrant. He viewed me not as a sister, but as a convenient dumping ground for his corporate liabilities. I picked up the heavy contract, my fingers tracing the embossed seal of the law firm. The sheer arrogance of his maneuver was staggering, an absolute masterclass in weaponized bureaucracy. The low growl of the corporate town car engine completely faded from the gravel driveway, leaving me alone in the vast, echoing silence of the workshop. I spread the thick, notarized contract across the cold steel surface of an industrial milling table, my eyes scanning the heavily structured liability clauses. My brother was notoriously methodical, a man who never rushed a corporate transaction unless he was actively covering a blind spot. His aggressive push for an immediate signature meant he was absolutely terrified of someone scrutinizing this specific building before the real estate demolition crews arrived. I did not reach for a pen. Instead, I stood perfectly still, closing my eyes and forcing my breathing to slow down. When you spend thousands of hours calibrating micro-escapements and regulating balance springs, your auditory cortex adapts to process minute frequencies that most people simply ignore. Beneath the steady hum of the external backup generator, I isolated a secondary acoustic signature. It was an ultra-low frequency, barely a whisper of vibration resonating deep within the structural foundation of the building itself. It felt less like a sound and more like a rhythmic pressure in my chest. I opened my eyes and inhaled deeply, analyzing the atmospheric composition of the room. Mixed with the sharp scent of old cutting fluid, there was an unmistakable sterile tang, a chemical trace of ozone and pure nitrogen. In precision horology, nitrogen purging systems are utilized to create a perfectly inert environment, eliminating all oxygen to prevent the microscopic oxidation of raw titanium and brass prototypes. That kind of advanced localized climate control technology did not belong in a defunct, abandoned woodworking zone. My gaze swept across the cavernous space, mentally dissecting the architectural layout. I recalled the faded blueprints I had seen in my father's home office as a teenager. The exterior dimensions of this rectangular brick warehouse measured 120 feet in length. Yet, judging from the internal load-bearing pillars and the placement of the rear exit, the interior floor space visibly stopped at 95 feet. A memory sharply pierced through the analytical haze. I was 12 years old, caught exploring the rear sectors of this very shop. My father, usually a stoic and composed man, had physically pulled me back with genuine alarm in his eyes. He had established an absolute non-negotiable directive. The entire southern wall of the assembly floor was strictly off-limits to everyone, including his own children. I grabbed a heavy-duty tactical flashlight from my tool bag and walked purposefully toward the southern perimeter. The area was meticulously obscured by towering stacks of reclaimed pine boards and rusted ventilation ducts, arranged to look like decades of random industrial hoarding. I began shifting the heavy timber aside, ignoring the splinters biting into my palms. Behind the elaborate pile of debris lay a section of the wall that completely defied the building's 19th century architecture. It was not constructed of aging brick or plaster. Instead, I was staring at a massive, seamless expanse of solid tongue and groove white oak, flawlessly integrated from the concrete floor to the steel rafters. Tracing the beam of my flashlight along the upper perimeter, I finally spotted the source of the chemical scent. Camouflaged behind a fake fire sprinkler line ran a sleek, insulated copper pipe, quietly feeding an active flow of inert gas directly behind the wooden facade. The heavy oak planks were not a structural support wall. They were a highly sophisticated blind hiding nearly 25 feet of unaccounted space. I carefully pried away the final heavy oak plank, with the edge of a crowbar letting the splintered wood clatter against the concrete floor. Beneath the elaborate architectural blind was not a hollow cavity, but a massive load-bearing steel bulkhead that looked like it belonged on a nuclear submarine. Forged directly into the center of this impenetrable metal barrier was a complex mechanical control panel. It was a multi-layered cryptex, a highly sophisticated cipher mechanism composed of concentric, independently rotating brass dials. I pulled the heavily oxidized key from my pocket, examining its jagged, asymmetrical teeth. The strange geometry suddenly made perfect sense. This was never a conventional key meant to throw a standard deadbolt. I guided the metal shaft into the central aperture of the cryptex. Instead of twisting it, I pushed forward. The key depressed inward with a sharp pneumatic hiss, disengaging the primary internal tumblers and unlocking the outer rings of the cipher. The brass dials were now free to rotate. There were 5 rings, each meticulously etched with micro-engraved numerals and gear ratios. To a corporate attorney, it was an impossible, impenetrable combination lock. To me, it was a deeply familiar language. I placed my fingers against the cold brass, thinking back to the countless hours spent absorbing the foundational mechanical engineering principles my father had drilled into my head. He had an absolute obsession with the Swiss lever escapement, the precise mechanical heartbeat that breathes life into a timepiece. I began to carefully align the dials according to the mathematical sequence of a perfectly regulated balance wheel. I turned the first ring to match the standard impulse angle. The second and third dials were aligned to the specific lift angle and amplitude parameters. I spent intense hours analyzing the ratios, testing the friction of the tumblers, and making microscopic adjustments to ensure the beat-error ratio was mathematically flawless. As the final brass ring clicked into its designated groove, a profound heavy resonance echoed through the steel bulkhead. Deep within the wall, massive locking cylinders simultaneously retracted. The entire steel partition, easily weighing several tons, silently glided along a frictionless, recessed track. It released a rush of hyper-purified, climate-controlled air that smelled faintly of sterile nitrogen, confirming the existence of a highly preserved environment. I stepped across the threshold. Motion sensor overhead LEDs flickered to life, illuminating a pristine, state-of-the-art archival vault completely isolated from the decaying warehouse outside. I scanned the immaculate room. There were no offshore bank accounts hidden in safes, and no pallets of physical wealth. Pierce had always assumed this property was bleeding utility money due to sheer incompetence, but those funds were actively maintaining this secret sanctuary. At the center of the vacuum-sealed room stood a single illuminated glass drafting table. Spread across its surface were dozens of original hand-drawn technical blueprints covered in my father's meticulous handwriting. Resting on a velvet display cushion directly adjacent to the schematics was a fully assembled raw titanium prototype. I picked up a specialized loop from the desk and leaned over the intricate metal structure. My breath caught in my throat. It was a revolutionary horological complication. My father had successfully engineered a true perpetual movement mechanism, an autonomous, frictionless kinetic engine capable of sustaining infinite energy distribution without degradation to the power reserve. This was the holy grail of precision engineering, a concept that global luxury conglomerates had spent billions trying to achieve. Under United States intellectual property law, an unpublished utility patent and trade secret of this magnitude possessed limitless commercial licensing value. Pierce had blindly forced me to take ownership of this building entirely unaware that he had just legally surrendered the most valuable industry-defining trade secret in modern history. Gripping the schematic bearing my father's unmistakable signature, I bypassed standard communication channels and established an encrypted connection to Jude. As a senior intellectual property auditor and mechanical technology specialist contracted by the elite Horology Institute, he was the only person I trusted with raw data of this magnitude. Operating primarily out of Boston, Jude was not a man prone to hyperbole or sudden excitement. His entire career was built on dismantling fraudulent patent claims, exposing counterfeit engineering, and protecting the intellectual assets of multinational conglomerates. Jude's flight landed at Pittsburgh International before dawn. When he stepped through the heavy steel bulkhead into the vacuum-sealed vault, he did not gasp or marvel at the pristine environment. His expression remained utterly stoic, masked behind a shield of clinical skepticism. Wearing anti-static nitrile gloves, he silently unpacked a mobile suite of forensic diagnostic equipment. For 6 uninterrupted hours, the only sounds in the room were the electronic hum of his devices. He deployed a high-resolution LiDAR scanner to capture the exact microgeometry of the titanium prototype, and utilized a macro-lens spectrometer to analyze the density of the metallic alloys. He absolutely refused to let me move or alter the physical state of the hand-drawn blueprints, treating the desk as an active preservation site. After securing his encrypted hard drives, he departed for a secure location to begin the grueling authentication protocol. The ensuing silence was excruciating. For 72 agonizing hours, I remained isolated in the defunct workshop, sleeping on the torn leather bench fiercely guarding the vault. Meanwhile, Jude was running the captured telemetry through highly restricted data silos. He had to meticulously cross-reference the structural schematics against the secure databases of the Swiss Federal Institute of Intellectual Property and the classified archives of the United States Patent and Trademark Office. He needed absolute verification that not a single gear ratio torque distribution model or escapement mechanism had ever been previously registered, abandoned, or stolen by a rival firm. The dedicated burner phone I had purchased specifically for this secure channel finally vibrated just past midnight. When I answered, Jude's typically composed authoritative baritone was audibly fractured, raspy with sleep deprivation and profound shock. "The mathematics are flawless," he breathed, bypassing any formal greeting. "I ran the kinetic decay algorithms through the mainframe 4 times because I refused to believe the initial output. Katrina, you are sitting on the holy grail of precision mechanics." He exhaustively explained that global luxury conglomerates had burned billions of dollars in aggressive research and development, desperately trying to solve the friction and energy degradation puzzle of a true perpetual movement engine. Every single corporate laboratory had failed. My father had solved it in absolute secrecy. Under the Federal Defend Trade Secrets Act, because this design had never been publicly disclosed or commercialized, it retained its ultimate legal status as an uncompromised, fully protectable asset. Jude laid out the staggering financial reality of the situation. Once we filed the utility patents through an anonymous holding company, the intellectual property would not be worth a mere $20 or $30 million in a direct buyout. It possessed infinite licensing potential. Major industry titans would be legally forced to pay exorbitant ongoing royalties just to utilize the foundational mechanics or face total market obsolescence. The sterile, climate-controlled air of the 40th floor glass conference room felt intentionally oppressive as I laid my pen down on the polished mahogany table. Across the expansive surface sat Pierce, flanked by Sterling and two junior associates. The panoramic view of the city skyline behind them was designed to intimidate, a visual reminder of the corporate empire I had been entirely exiled from. I kept my posture slumped just enough to project total defeat, perfectly playing the role of a financially cornered woman who had finally been broken by the system. I pushed the heavy covenant for site remediation back toward the center of the table. "I will assume the environmental liability," I said, my voice deliberately hollow, stripped of any lingering defiance. "I will hire the hazmat teams, clear the industrial lubricants, and guarantee the property passes the municipal environmental inspection so your developers can break ground." A fleeting, triumphant smirk tugged at the corner of Pierce's mouth. He thought he had won. He believed he had successfully weaponized the federal environmental code to bury me under a mountain of hazardous waste debt while cleaning up his own lucrative real estate portfolio. Before Sterling could pull the accepted contract away, I smoothly slid a single crisp sheet of paper on top of the stack. "I only require one standard indemnification rider," I murmured, keeping my gaze fixed on my hands. "If I am taking on the absolute legal responsibility for disposing of decades of industrial garbage, I need an ironclad guarantee that the corporation will not retroactively claim any scrap materials I manage to salvage and sell to offset my impending bankruptcy." Pierce frowned, leaning forward to inspect the document. It was a meticulously crafted intellectual property quitclaim and waiver of rights, drafted by Jude using airtight federal terminology. The clause explicitly surrendered full, exclusive, and irrevocable ownership of any uncatalogued schematics, handwritten documentation, draft utility patents, physical prototypes, and mechanical refuse currently residing within the physical boundaries of the designated property. Sterling's trained legal instincts instantly flared. He pulled the document toward him, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the precise legal lexicon. "This is unusually broad terminology for scrap metal." The senior counsel noted, his voice laced with sudden caution. He turned to my brother. "Pierce, I strongly advise against executing a blanket waiver on uninventoried assets. Before we authorize this addendum, we need to dispatch an independent auditing firm to the warehouse to physically catalog every item inside that structure." For a fraction of a second, the entire operation hung by a thread. If an auditor breached that steel partition, the perpetual movement prototype would be seized immediately. But Jude and I had factored in the most predictable variable in the equation: Pierce's staggering arrogance. My brother scoffed loudly, rolling his eyes at his own legal counsel. He was mere days away from closing an 8-figure escrow with a ruthless commercial developer who was actively threatening to walk away if the site was not legally cleared by the end of the fiscal quarter. To Pierce, delaying a massive liquidity-generating land acquisition to inventory a rotting warehouse full of our late father's senile hoarding tendencies was the epitome of corporate incompetence. He had always despised the mechanical side of the business, viewing it as dirty, outdated labor compared to his modern high-rise acquisitions. "We are not halting a massive commercial development to count rusty gears and termite-infested workbenches," Pierce snapped, snatching his gold fountain pen from the desk. Utterly convinced that nothing of value could possibly exist in that decaying shell, he aggressively signed his name across the bottom of the addendum. With 3 quick strokes of ink, blinded by hubris and the rush of a real estate victory, he legally surrendered the most revolutionary technological breakthrough of the century. The blinding strobe of thousands of camera flashes cascaded across the vaulted ceilings of the Palexpo Convention Center in Geneva. I stepped up to the minimalist obsidian podium, looking out over a sea of international horology journalists, luxury conglomerate executives, and elite venture capitalists. Behind me, a massive high-definition screen illuminated the intricately rendered schematics of our flagship timepiece. As the newly established CEO of the industry's most disruptive mechanical engineering firm, I officially unveiled the fully operational perpetual movement engine. Our proprietary technology was now fortified behind an impenetrable fortress of international patents, legally untouchable and commercially limitless. Halfway across the globe, the financial shockwaves hit Wall Street before the European markets even closed. Sitting in his corner office, Pierce stared at the live Bloomberg broadcast, his face drained of all color. The mechanical prototype he had aggressively dismissed as rusted garbage was now being heralded as a billion-dollar technological revolution. Driven by sheer panic and absolute entitlement, he immediately mobilized his corporate legal team, filing a desperate multi-million-dollar lawsuit in federal district court, claiming corporate espionage and demanding the immediate seizure of my intellectual property. The preliminary injunction hearing lasted less than 20 minutes. Standing before the federal judge, Pierce's high-priced litigators laid out their demands. In response, my legal counsel calmly submitted a single piece of physical evidence, the countersigned intellectual property quitclaim. The judge adjusted his glasses, reading the precise clause where Pierce had explicitly, voluntarily, and irrevocably surrendered all rights to the uncatalogued designs and mechanical prototypes. The lawsuit was instantly dismissed with prejudice. The court ruled that Pierce had not been defrauded. He had simply been blinded by his own corporate negligence and overwhelming hubris. The public humiliation of the dismissed lawsuit was a fatal blow to his reputation. The investors backing his massive commercial real estate ventures panicked, realizing that Pierce possessed such catastrophic lapses in judgment, literally signing away the most valuable asset in their portfolio without an audit. The primary equity partners withdrew their capital overnight. His overarching corporation plunged into a severe liquidity crisis, drowning in the very debt he had tried to outrun. Estelle, possessing the ruthless survival instincts of a sinking ship's rat, did not wait for the final bankruptcy filings. Recognizing the impending financial collapse, she quietly liquidated her private trusts, transferred her remaining liquid assets to offshore accounts, and had her attorneys drop a divorce petition heavily favoring her financial exit on Pierce's desk. He was left entirely alone in a crumbling empire of his own making. I never called him. I never sent a gloating email or offered a single word of reconciliation. The ultimate revenge was not a screaming match. It was the absolute deafening silence of my absence. I stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my Boston headquarters, watching the snow fall over the city. I had taken the rusted key of my exile and used it to unlock a legacy, leaving the architect of my destruction to quietly suffocate in the ruins of his own arrogance. Outro lessons and perspectives. What is the ultimate takeaway from Katrina's journey? This story serves as a powerful testament to the fact that true value is rarely obvious to the arrogant. Pierce equated worth with immediate superficial aesthetics and fast cash, ultimately blinding himself to a generational treasure. Katrina, on the other hand, utilized intellect, patience, and emotional control to transform a cruel family betrayal into an undeniable victory. The audience is left with a profound realization: the most devastating form of revenge against toxic family members isn't violence, revenge plots, or endless arguing. It is cutting them off completely, securing your own success, and letting their own toxic nature engineer their inevitable downfall. What would you have done if you were handed that rusty key? Do you agree with Katrina's absolute silence at the end? Let us know your thoughts and personal perspectives in the comments below.